Hey guys, Bangity Bangs here. In this video we're going to be talking about cells and their organelles. Now, in the last video we touched on what cells are. Okay, they're the basic unit of life. They're very, very small. You can't see them with your naked eye. You have to have a microscope. And we talked about the two main types of cells, okay, the prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells, prokaryotes being the more primitive, and eukaryotes having these membrane-bound organelles that we're going to get into. And when I say organelles, think about what that word looks like to you. It probably looks really similar to another word that you've heard of. It's like organs. Kind of, how we have organs that do specific functions in our bodies, like hearts to pump blood around, or livers to detoxify our blood, or brains to think, all the organs that we have that make us what we are. Cells also have specific parts that do specific functions within their little cell bodies. And the first organelle that I want to talk about, probably the most widely known organelle, is the nucleus, and it's really easy to identify in any cell that you look at through a typical light microscope, but the nucleus is going to be what directs all the cell activities. That's kind of like a typical textbook answer that you'll see a lot, but really what the nucleus is it's a housing place for something called DNA, which you may have heard of before. It's the cell's genetic material, and that's going to be contained inside the nucleus. And it's also important to note that you're only going to find a nucleus in eukaryotic cells, not prokaryotic cells, right? Even though both types of cells have DNA and need DNA to survive, in prokaryotes, their DNA is just kind of free-floating in what we call their cytoplasm in a big circular chromosome. All right, in eukaryotes, it's organized a little bit differently. It's tied up in what we call linear chromosomes, and those are going to be housed within the nucleus. All right, so the next organelle on our list is called the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane. You'll sometimes hear it called that too, but its job is basically just to be a barrier. All right? It's going to define the outer boundaries of the cell, and it's made of this special type of molecule called a phospholipid. Actually, two layers of phospholipids that are going to control what exactly can enter and leave the cell. We'll get into a little bit more detail in a later video when we talk specifically about the plasma membrane and how it works, but just for now, know that it's a barrier, defines the outer boundaries of the cell, controls what can enter and leave. And it's also pretty important to note that plasma membranes are going to be found in all cell types, okay, both eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And moving on, we got ribosomes next. Now these are another type of organelle that are going to be found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and they're going to be all over the place in both of them, because even by tiny little organelle standards, remember we're talking about stuff that is so small that we need microscopes to see. Ribosomes are even super small on that scale, so you would need something like a scanning electron microscope to even see them. But basically, what they are is they're little protein factories, okay? Now, right now, you might not really have a good understanding of what I mean when I talk about proteins. You might know that you need them for muscles, and they're in a lot of foods that you eat, but proteins have a huge role to play in biology. They're going to be very, very important, and ribosomes, their job is to make those proteins. And proteins basically get all the work done inside your cells and your body. So ribosomes, all of your cells need lots of them. They're going to be scattered all throughout the cytoplasm, and usually when you see them represented in diagrams, they just look like a bunch of little dots. It's kind of scattered everywhere because, again, they're just super small, even on the cellular scale. But they are also typically going to be embedded in another type of organelle, which we'll get to a little bit later, called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. All right, this next organelle is called mitochondria. Now, mitochondria is actually pretty famous for an organelle on the internet, at least anyway. And if you haven't heard it yet, then you'll surely hear it at some point over the course of your high school career when you take biology. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You'll hear that a million times, I'm sure, and never forget it. But you might not understand really how important mitochondria really are. They're the organelles that are responsible for producing energy in cells. Okay, and it's worth noting they're only going to be found in eukaryotic cells, not prokaryotic cells, because they can actually just do this only with their membrane. But mitochondria, their job is to make energy out of the food that we eat, and really what they're making is a molecule called ATP, but that's sort of like the cell's energy currency. Mitochondria, by the way, are organelles that you're probably going to want to be able to recognize on sight in diagrams because they show up a lot in test questions. You know, test makers and teachers, they love to throw these guys in diagrams and have you identify them. Okay, they have a pretty characteristic kidney bean shape on diagrams with these little folds in the middle, which we call cristae. Right, and those folds are basically just to increase surface area to make them function more efficiently. So next is called the Golgi Apparatus, or sometimes Golgi bodies. You might see either term, but really this is just kind of a folded membrane. It's like the cell's membrane folded on itself, but it's this specialized structure that actually will modify and package proteins that are made by the cell before they might be shipped out to some other part of the body or to some other part of the cell. So a typical analogy that you hear a lot with the Golgi apparatus is it's sort of like the UPS center for the cell. Its job is to package and ship proteins and get them ready for transport. In Golgi bodies, since they are a membrane-bound organelle, they're going to be found in eukaryotes but not prokaryotes. Next we have lysosomes. So these look like little bubbles in the cell usually when you see them in diagrams, but they have a pretty important job. They contain a lot of digestive enzymes, okay, which are these specialized little proteins that can serve a variety of functions. But in the case of lysosomes, their enzymes are for digestion. So lysosomes are important if you have something that comes into the cell that needs to be broken down, right? It could be, usually it's like a foreign body or something that might harm the cell, okay? But sometimes there are cases when a cell is actually going to need to, commit suicide, if you will, or what we call apoptosis, cell death. If it gets infected by a virus, for instance, that might be a case where that reaction would need to be triggered. So in that case, a lysosome is going to release all those enzymes and actually break down the cell. So pretty intense organelles. And lysosomes are another one that's going to be found in eukaryotes but not prokaryotes. All right, next is the endoplasmic reticulum, or a lot of times it's just abbreviated ER. And we already talked about this a little bit. I mentioned the rough ER is going to be covered in ribosomes. Okay, there's also a smooth ER that helps to do certain things like break down alcohols and toxins in cells. But one of their main functions is to help to create proteins, right? Especially the rough ER. As the ribosomes are making proteins, they're going to start out as these long chain looking molecules, and the endoplasmic reticulum is going to help to fold that chain into a particular shape that is going to be the protein that then goes on to do whatever function it was made for. And so the endoplasmic reticulum, if you have to identify it, it's usually pretty easy. They tend to be right around the nucleus, just more folds of the cell's membrane. And since these are membrane-bound organelles, again, they're going to be in eukaryotes but not prokaryotes. Okay, now all of the organelles that I've mentioned thus far are going to be found in all types of eukaryotic cells, right? A few of them even in prokaryotic cells like the ribosomes. But the rest of them are going to be found in all types of eukaryotes. So that's animal cells, plant cells, fungi, and protozoa. Okay, but there are a few organelles that are going to be specific to only some types of eukaryotes, but you're not going to find them in others. So we're going to get to a few of those now. And the first one is a cell wall. All right, now notably, animal cells do not have a cell wall. All right, they can get by with just their plasma membrane. But if you're a plant or a fungus or a bacterium, then a lot of times you're going to have a cell wall. And you may also need to understand the differences between the different types of cell walls depending on what type of cell you are. If you're a plant, for instance, then your cell wall is made of cellulose, all right, and it's used to provide a rigid structure for your cell and support. Okay, maybe if your cell gets too full of water, or if it doesn't have enough water, it can kind of help the cell maintain its shape instead of growing or shrinking out of control. And it's also going to have lots of holes in it to connect it to cells on either side called plasmodesmata. And that cell wall is made of cellulose, which is really just a bunch of sugar molecules linked together in one big long chain. If you're a fungus, on the other hand, then your cell wall is going to be made of a substance called chitin, or kitten, sometimes you hear it pronounced that way, made out of sugars and nitrogen. If you're a bacterium, on the other hand, then your cell wall is going to be made of a substance called peptidoglycan, which is a structure composed of various sugars and proteins. And if you're an archaebacterium, then your cell wall is going to be composed of other materials, but at this level, you're not going to need to worry about that. Which is good because honestly I have no idea what those other materials are. I didn't look that part up for this video. And another organelle that's going to be very important for you to know is the chloroplast. Okay, now that's going to be found mostly in plant cells, but also some protists that need to do this process that you may have heard of before called photosynthesis, where basically they're going to take energy from sunlight and use it to create sugars. Alright, that is going to be basically a temporary storage molecule for energy that cells need to do all the things that they do. And that's especially good for us humans because we don't have chloroplasts in our cells like no animal cells do. The only way for us to get energy is to eat plants or to eat other things that ate plants, and so those sugars can get passed along into our bodies, and our cells can break them down to make that delicious ATP that we need for our energy to do all of the living that we do. And we'll get into more of the specifics about how chloroplasts work when we talk about photosynthesis, but for now, just know that they're able to take carbon dioxide and water from their environment and using sunlight convert that into a molecule called glucose, which is a type of sugar that is useful for storing energy. Alright, and last but not least on our list we have vacuoles, which are basically just big storage sacks of water and some food and salt and other materials, but notably plants are going to have one huge vacuole, while animal cells are going to have several smaller vacuoles kind of scattered throughout. They're a little bit more interesting in plants, I think. They serve a bit more of a role. They help a plant to control what we call its turgor pressure, which is a way of referring to how much water the plant has in it. Okay, if it gets a lot of water into the cells, it's going to store that in the vacuole, and that vacuole is going to expand and push against the sides of the cell, against that cell wall, and keep the plant really rigid. If the plant cell doesn't have as much water, then that vacuole is going to be more limp, and the cell isn't going to have that turgor pressure, and so in turn the cell and the plant is going to be a little bit more limp. That's why if you have something like wilted lettuce in your refrigerator, if you pour a little water on it, it can help make it a little bit more livelier and healthy looking. And a lot of protists have vacuoles too to store nutrients or even waste, and some have what's called contractile vacuoles that are pretty cool. They can actually squeeze on themselves or expand to actively control the water content inside the cell. And there's another thing that I almost didn't mention called the cytoskeleton, because it's not really an organelle like these other examples, but it's still really important. So after a few days of thinking about it, I decided I need to go ahead and put it in here. Basically, it's going to be a network of spindle fibers that goes all around the cell, and it's made up of special proteins that give it structure and support. And there are really two main types of filaments. One is called microfibers, and the other is microtubules. Microtubules are, like they sound, kind of tubular, and they're a little bit thicker, and then the microfibers are more thin, but both work together to film these really intricate networks. And in addition to helping the cell maintain structure, they also aid in motility of things like proteins and other molecules. Once the cell creates proteins or other molecules and packages them into transport vesicles, and then motor proteins can take them and move them anywhere they need to go in the cell or outside of the cell, using these microfibers and microtubules as a network, sort of like a highway or something, or like trucks carrying cargo down a highway. And so you can see how those are going to be really important when we get to talking about cell transport and cell communication. Alright you guys, well I think that's enough organelles to get you going, at least starting to know your way around a cell and knowing some of the big differences between prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells, for instance, and also within eukaryotic cells, understand we have animals and plants, fungi and protists. All of them are going to have some organelles in common and some that are going to be unique to one or a few of those cell types. Hopefully you took something away from this and you learned a few things, and I will see you guys in the next video.